The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Judge Michael Harrison's chambers, casting long shadows across his polished mahogany desk. At 45, he had cultivated an image of unwavering authority. His silver-streaked hair always perfectly trimmed, his black robes pressed and pristine. This morning, like every morning for the past 15 years, he adjusted his collar with practiced precision while reviewing the day's docket. His clerk, James, knocked softly before entering with a fresh stack of files. "Good morning, Your Honor. You have 37 cases today." James placed the files on the corner of the desk, one folder slightly askew from the others. "The Johnson case is scheduled for 9:30. Harrison nodded, barely glancing up from his morning coffee. Yet something about that name, Johnson, tickled the edge of his consciousness like a half-remembered dream. He reached for the file, noting the first name, Sarah Johnson. The feeling intensified, though he couldn't place why. Through his chamber windows, he could see the Atlanta skyline stretching toward the cloudy October sky. 15 years on the bench had taught him to trust his instincts, and something about this case felt different. He opened the file, scanning the details with his usual thoroughness. A routine matter, nothing that should cause this strange sense of anticipation. His office told the story of his success: law school diplomas from Harvard, certificates of appreciation from the Bar Association, and photographs with prominent legal figures adorned the walls. Each accolade represented a step in his carefully planned journey from law student to respected judge. His parents, though both passed now, had been pillars of the legal community, their legacy living on through his accomplishments. A glance at his watch showed 8:45. Harrison stood, walking to the full-length mirror beside his private bathroom. He straightened his robes, a ritual that helped him transition into his judicial persona. The face that looked back at him was one that commanded respect. Strong jaw, clear blue eyes, and features that had graced numerous legal journal covers. "Your Honor," James appeared at the door again. "Mrs. Peterson from the Bar Association called about next week's charity gala. She needs to confirm your attendance." "Tell her I'll be there," Harrison replied, his voice carrying the measured tone he perfected over years of bench rulings. Yet even as he spoke, his mind wandered back to the Johnson file. Sarah Johnson, 68 years old, a retired nurse. The details were unremarkable, but the nagging feeling persisted. He walked toward his courtroom, footsteps echoing in the marble hallway. The morning light caught the gold lettering on his courtroom door, Judge Michael Harrison, Courtroom 3A. As he reached for the handle, a court officer hurried up. "Judge Harrison, there's been a schedule change. The 9 o'clock case has requested a continuance. Sarah Johnson will be your first case." Harrison paused, his hand on the door. That name again. Through the frosted glass, he could make out the shapes of people settling into their places, unaware of the strange tension building in his chest. He took a deep breath, centering himself as he'd done countless times before. "Very well," he said, squaring his shoulders. "Let's begin." As he pushed open the heavy wooden door, Harrison couldn't shake the feeling that this ordinary Tuesday morning was about to become anything but ordinary. The courtroom hushed as Judge Harrison took his seat, the leather chair creaking softly beneath his weight. He gazed across the room, his eyes automatically finding the defendant's area. There stood Sarah Johnson, her presence somehow both diminutive and commanding. She wore a powder blue dress that spoke of careful preparation, her silver hair styled with precision, and a single strand of pearls adorned her neck. "Case number 2347. Sarah Johnson," the clerk announced, his voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room. As Sarah stepped forward, Harrison noticed something unusual about her demeanor. Unlike most people who appeared before him, she showed no signs of nervousness. Instead, her warm brown eyes held his gaze with quiet confidence, almost as if she were the one presiding over the proceedings. "Mrs. Johnson," Harrison began, consulting the file before him, "you're here today regarding—" He paused as she smiled, a gentle expression that seemed strangely familiar, like a photograph he'd seen long ago but couldn't quite place. "Yes, Your Honor," she responded, her voice carrying a hint of Southern grace. "But if I may, there's something I'd like to address before we proceed." Her hands, folded neatly before her, showed no trace of trembling. Harrison found himself nodding, despite the break in protocol. "You may continue, Mrs. Johnson." "Do you remember the summer of 1978? She asked, her words falling into the courtroom like stones into still water. "It was particularly warm that year. The magnolias bloomed twice." The judge's hand, poised to make notes, froze above his paper. Something about her words, about the way she spoke of that distant summer, sent an unexpected shiver down his spine. The courtroom seemed to fade around him as fragments of memory, or perhaps dreams, flickered at the edges of his consciousness. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, working to maintain his professional demeanor, "I'm afraid I don't see the relevance." "You were born in August," she continued, her voice soft but clear, "at Grady Memorial Hospital. It was a Tuesday morning, just before dawn." Her eyes never left his face, studying his features as if memorizing them anew. Harrison felt the color drain from his face. These were details he knew to be true, but they weren't public record. The courtroom, usually a space he controlled completely, suddenly felt airless and strange. "The nursery was on the 3rd floor," Sarah went on, her words carrying a weight that seemed to press him back in his chair. "They wrapped you in a blue blanket with tiny stars on it. You had a small birthmark, right here." She touched her own right earlobe, exactly where Harrison knew his own mark resided. The gallery had grown so quiet that the tick of the wall clock seemed to echo. Harrison's throat felt dry as he struggled to maintain his composure. His gavel lay forgotten in his hand as memories he didn't know he had began to surface. The scent of magnolias, a soft humming voice, the warmth of summer sunshine through a hospital window. "Your Honor," Sarah said, reaching into her handbag with deliberate slowness, "I have something that belongs to you, something I've kept safe for 45 years." She withdrew an envelope, worn at the edges and yellowed with age. "Perhaps we should discuss this in your chambers. There's so much to tell." The courtroom waited, suspended in a moment that felt both endless and instant, as Judge Michael Harrison faced a truth he never knew he was missing. The leather album sat on Judge Harrison's desk like a time capsule waiting to be opened. He dismissed the court immediately after Sarah's revelation, his hands trembling slightly as he called for a recess. Now, alone in his chambers, he stared at the worn leather binding, its surface smooth from years of handling. Sarah had left it with his clerk, along with a note that read simply, "When you're ready." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across his desk as he traced the album's edges with his fingertips, gathering courage to open it. Finally, he lifted the cover. The first page held a black and white photograph, slightly curved at the corners, showing a young woman in a nurse's uniform. Her smile was unmistakable, the same one he'd just seen in his courtroom. "Sarah Johnson, Grady Memorial Hospital, 1977, read the careful handwriting beneath. His throat tightened as he turned the page. There she was again, this time clearly expecting, standing beneath a magnolia tree in full bloom. The next photo showed her in a hospital bed, cradling a newborn. The baby's face was barely visible, wrapped in a starred blue blanket, exactly as she'd described. His hands began to shake as he read the notation. "My beautiful boy, August 15, 1978. Letters fell from between the pages as he turned them. Dozens of them, never sent but carefully dated. He opened one at random, dated September 1995. "My dearest son, today I watched you graduate from law school. I stood at the back of the auditorium, my heart bursting with pride as you walked across that stage. You looked so much like your father in your graduation robes." Harrison sank into his chair, the weight of these revelations pressing him down. More photos followed. Newspaper clippings of his achievements, a distant shot of his judicial inauguration, carefully preserved programs from events where he'd spoken. She had been there, watching, documenting, loving from afar. Near the end of the album, he found a formal letter from Grady Memorial Hospital, dated 1978. It detailed the adoption arrangement, signed by both Sarah and his parents. A separate note, in his mother's handwriting, promised to give him the best life possible and to honor his heritage in our hearts. The final page held a recent photograph of Sarah, standing before a community health clinic where she'd served as director for 20 years. The caption read, "Your mother's life's work, helping others, just like I hope you would." Beside it lay a small card with an address and phone number. Harrison closed the album, his judicial composure cracking. He walked to his window, looking out at the Atlanta skyline as emotions he couldn't name washed over him. In the reflection of the glass, he studied his own features he'd always attributed to his father's side of the family. Now he saw them anew. His mother's eyes, her gentle smile, the determined set of her chin. His intercom buzzed, startling him. "Your Honor." His clerk's voice came through. "The afternoon docket." "Cancel it," Harrison said firmly. "Cancel everything for the rest of the day." He picked up his phone, fingers hovering over the keypad as he looked at Sarah's number. Outside his window, a magnolia tree swayed in the autumn breeze, its few remaining blossoms nodding as if in encouragement. He dialed the number, each digit bringing him closer to a truth he never knew he was seeking. That evening, Judge Harrison stood in his parents' old study, a room he preserved exactly as they'd left it after their passing 2 years ago. The familiar scent of leather-bound law books and his father's pipe tobacco lingered in the air. He'd come here countless times before, but tonight, every photograph, every memento held a new significance. His fingers trailed along the spines of legal volumes until he reached the hidden panel his father had installed decades ago, a secret compartment he'd discovered during the estate settlement but had never fully explored. Inside, he found a wooden box, its brass clasp dulled with age. Settling into his father's worn leather chair, Harrison opened the box with trembling hands. Inside lay a stack of documents, yellowed with time but meticulously preserved. The first was his original birth certificate, listing Sarah Johnson as his mother. Beneath it, adoption papers detailed a carefully orchestrated legal process, signed by both Sarah and his parents, Richard and Eleanor Harrison. A letter from his father to the adoption agency caught his eye. "We understand the sensitivity of this situation and commit to providing this child with every advantage while honoring his heritage. Our position in the community will ensure his protection and opportunities, as his biological mother wishes." Harrison reached for the crystal decanter on his father's desk, untouched since his passing, and poured a small measure of bourbon. Family photos on the wall seemed to watch him. Hiking trips, graduation ceremonies, family dinners. Each memory now carried a new layer of meaning. In the box, he discovered a series of annual reports from a private investigator. His parents had quietly kept track of Sarah's life, ensuring she was well and respecting her wish to remain distant. The reports painted a picture of a remarkable woman. Night school to earn her nursing degree, community service awards, promotions to hospital administration. A sealed envelope at the bottom of the box bore his name in his mother's elegant handwriting. Inside, he found a letter dated just months before her death. "My dearest Michael, if you're reading this, you've discovered the truth we protected for so many years. Your father and I debated countless times about telling you, but we honored Sarah's wish to let you forge your own path without the burden of this knowledge. Know that your birth mother's sacrifice came from a place of pure love. We watched her watch you from afar, saw her quiet pride in your achievements. She gave you life twice, once at birth, and again by choosing us to raise you in a world that wasn't ready for her truth. We loved you fiercely, completely, but we always knew we shared that love with another mother's heart. Find her, Michael. Complete the circle that began in that summer of 1978. With all my love, Mom." Harrison wiped his eyes, the bourbon forgotten. On his phone, dozens of missed calls from the courthouse demanded attention, But another notification held his gaze, a text message from an unknown number. "Thank you for not turning me away today. I'm ready to talk when you are. Sarah." Outside, a late-night storm rolled across Atlanta, lightning illuminating the study in brief, bright flashes. In those moments of clarity, Harrison began to see his life's story being rewritten, not erased, but expanded into a truth more complex and beautiful than he'd ever imagined. The Sweet Auburn Cafe sat quietly on the corner, its morning rush dwindling to a few scattered customers. Judge Harrison arrived 15 minutes early, choosing the secluded booth by the window where autumn sunlight filtered through lace curtains. He'd removed his judicial robes, wearing instead a simple blue sweater that his mother, Eleanor, had given him last Christmas. Sarah arrived precisely on time, carrying a weathered leather handbag and wearing the same strand of pearls from court. The morning light caught the silver in her hair as she slid into the booth, her movements graceful despite her age. For a moment, neither spoke, both studying the features they shared. The same determined chin, the same arch of eyebrows. "I always came here," Sarah finally said, smoothing her napkin, "on your birthday. Every year. They serve sweet potato pie that reminds me of my grandmother's recipe." She paused as the waitress brought coffee. "I watched you grow up in newspaper clippings and glimpses, your first spelling bee victory in 4th grade. You wore a red body." Harrison's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee. "You were there. Last row, behind the stage. You spelled perseverance perfectly." Her smile carried years of stored pride. "I chose your name, you know. Michael, after my father. The Harrisons added Thomas as your middle name, after Richard's grandfather. They sent me a letter asking if I approved. They were kind, kinder than the times required." From her handbag, Sarah withdrew a small photo album, different from the one she'd left at court. "These are just for you," she said softly. "Pictures of your grandparents, my parents. Your grandfather was a minister, and your grandmother taught music. They never knew about you, but you have her hands, perfect for piano." As they talked, the morning stretched into afternoon. Sarah shared stories of her life, working 3 jobs to put herself through nursing school, becoming head nurse at Grady Memorial, establishing community health programs in underserved neighborhoods. She spoke without bitterness, each word carrying the weight of lived experience. "There's something I need to ask," Harrison said during a quiet moment. "Why now? After all these years?" Sarah's eyes misted as she reached across the table, her hand stopping just short of touching his. "Last month, I was diagnosed with early-stage pancreatic cancer." She held up her other hand as Harrison started to speak. "It's treatable, and I'm fighting. But it made me realize I couldn't leave this earth without you knowing the whole truth of who you are." Harrison finally bridged the gap between their hands, his larger one enveloping her smaller one. The touch seemed to release something in both of them. Years of unspoken words, of distant love, of waiting. "Your father," Sarah continued softly, "was brilliant but afraid. Dr. James Cooper. He passed away 5 years ago, never knowing the man you became. That was his loss, his choice. But I chose differently. I chose to love you from afar, to protect your future, to watch you become someone extraordinary." Outside, fallen leaves danced across the sidewalk as Atlanta life rushed by, unaware of the quiet reunion taking place behind the cafe's lace curtains. Inside, mother and son began the delicate work of weaving together 2 lifetimes of separate stories into one shared truth. The North Georgia mountains rose before Judge Harrison as he guided his car along winding roads, autumn colors painting the landscape in brilliant golds and reds. He'd taken a week's leave from the courthouse, renting a small cabin near Blue Ridge Lake. The solitude offered space to process the seismic shifts in his identity. Inside the cabin, he'd created a makeshift timeline on the pine-paneled wall, photographs and documents spanning 45 years. Sarah's album formed the centerpiece, surrounded by his own memories and achievements. In the morning light, he sat in a rocking chair by the window, pen hovering over fresh stationery. "Dear Sarah, He began writing. Today I watched the sunrise over the mountains and saw it with new eyes. I've been thinking about that spelling bee you mentioned. I remember being nervous, but feeling a strange sense of calm when I looked toward the back of the auditorium. Was that you, sending silent strength? He paused, watching a pair of cardinals dart between trees. His phone lay silent on the table, court matters temporarily delegated to his colleagues. Here, surrounded by nature's quiet wisdom, he began to understand the weight of Sarah's choices. Taking fresh paper, he continued, I've been reviewing my case files from the past decade. Each decision I made shaped lives, just as your decision shaped mine. I see now how my background, or what I thought was my background, influenced my perspective from the bench. Your revelation has made me question not just my personal history, but my professional legacy. The afternoon brought rain, drops pattering against the cabin's tin roof. Harrison pulled out the medical information Sarah had shared about her diagnosis. He'd already contacted the top oncologists in Atlanta, setting up consultations. His legal pad filled with notes about treatment options, clinical trials, and support services. As evening approached, he opened his laptop to find an email from Sarah. My dearest Michael, today I told my church group about you. Their joy and acceptance reminded me that love knows no boundaries. I've enclosed a recording of my mother, your grandmother, singing in the church choir. Her voice carried the same strength I see in you. Harrison clicked the attached audio file. A rich soprano voice filled the cabin, singing an old spiritual. He closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him, imagining generations of strength flowing through his veins. On the cabin's small deck, under a blanket of stars, he wrote again, Sarah, I understand now why the Harrisons chose this place for our family retreats. These mountains hold secrets and wisdom. They teach us that the strongest trees have deep, complex root systems, often intertwined with others in ways invisible above ground. Like those trees, I'm discovering that my strength comes from more than one source. His judicial notepad, usually filled with case law citations, now held different kinds of notes. Ask Sarah about her favorite books. Learn more about Grandpa's ministry. Plan Sunday dinners. Research pancreatic cancer survival rates. Look into community health initiatives. The moon rose over the mountains, casting silver light across the lake. Harrison added a final note to his day's writings. Tomorrow, I'll begin the drive back to Atlanta, back to the courthouse. But I'm returning as a different man, not changed. Exactly, but completed. You filled in pieces of my story I never knew were missing. Thank you for your courage, both then and now. He signed his name and added, for the first time, your son. Sunday morning light streamed through Sarah's kitchen windows as she taught Judge Harrison how to make her grandmother's sweet potato pie. The familiar scent of nutmeg and cinnamon filled the modest but well-kept home in historic West End. Family photos, both old and new, now lined her walls, their separate histories gradually weaving together. The secret, Sarah explained, her hands guiding his through the motions of crimping the pie crust, is in how gently you handle the dough. Her strength had returned after her second round of treatment, her determination matching the spring warmth that had begun to touch Atlanta. Harrison watched her movements carefully, noting how they mirrored his own unconscious habits, the way they both tilted their heads when concentrating, how their hands moved with the same deliberate grace. These small discoveries continued to delight them both. Your grandmother used to sing while she baked, Sarah shared, reaching for a mixing bowl. She taught music to 3 generations of children in this neighborhood. The piano in the living room was her wedding gift. She paused, smiling. I heard you play at the community center last week. You have her gift. Harrison glanced at the old upright piano visible through the doorway. He'd started playing again, finding that his fingers remembered the lessons from his childhood. I always wondered where that talent came from, he said softly. The Harrisons were tone deaf. Their Sunday gatherings had become a ritual over the past few months. Sometimes they cooked together. Other times, they simply talked, filling in the decades of absence with stories. Sarah shared tales of her nursing career, of lives saved and communities served. Harrison brought court documents from interesting cases, seeking her perspective on matters of justice and mercy. "I have something for you," Sarah said, opening a drawer as their pie baked. She withdrew a small box, weathered but carefully preserved. "These belong to your grandfather, my father. His cufflinks from his ordination day. I've been waiting for the right moment." Harrison opened the box, finding a pair of simple silver cufflinks engraved with crosses. "I remember seeing similar ones in the photo of him at the pulpit," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He wore them every Sunday for 40 years, Sarah replied, touching them gently. "He believed that true justice came from a place of compassion. Like father, like grandson, it seems." The timer chimed, and Sarah moved to check the pie. Harrison watched her, noting how she no longer tried to hide her pride when looking at him. They'd moved past the initial awkwardness, finding a rhythm that honored both their lost time and their present connection. Later, as they shared pie on her screened porch, watching cardinals visit the feeders Sarah maintained, Harrison brought up an idea he'd been considering. "The county's starting a community justice initiative," he said. "They're looking for advisory board members with healthcare experience. Someone who understands both medicine and social needs." Sarah's eyes sparkled with interest. "Tell me more," she said, leaning forward in her rocking chair. As the afternoon sun painted shadows across the porch, mother and son discussed ways to serve their community together, their individual paths finally converging into a shared purpose. The pie plate between them emptied as they planned, their comfortable silence punctuated by moments of shared laughter and understanding glances that spoke of newfound family bonds. The Atlanta Community Justice Center opened its doors on a bright spring morning, 1 year after Sarah first stepped into Judge Harrison's courtroom. The modern building's glass facade reflected the sunrise, its entrance adorned with a simple plaque, "Everyone deserves to be heard." Inside the main conference room, Sarah adjusted her presentation materials, her hand steady and sure. The cancer treatments have been successful, her strength returning with each passing month. At 70, she'd become the center's most passionate advocate, bringing decades of healthcare experience to their mission of equitable justice. Judge Harrison stood at the podium, surveying the packed room. Legal professionals, healthcare workers, and community leaders filled every seat, drawn by the innovative program he and Sarah had developed together. His judicial robes were absent today. This wasn't about authority, but understanding. "A year ago," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the room, "I learned that justice isn't just about laws. It's about seeing the whole story." He glanced at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. "My mother, both my mothers, taught me that true justice requires understanding where people come from and what shaped their journey." The presentation screen displayed photographs of their initiatives: medical clinics offering services to court participants, mentorship programs pairing legal professionals with community members, educational workshops bridging gaps between law enforcement and local neighborhoods. Each project bore the fingerprints of both Harrison's legal expertise and Sarah's community healthcare experience. During the break, Sarah joined him by the window overlooking the city. "Your grandmother would be proud," she said softly, touching the piano key bookmark extending from her program, a gift from Harrison, commemorating their shared musical heritage. She always said that harmony comes from different notes finding their place together. Their story had spread organically through the legal community, not as scandal, but as inspiration. Other jurisdictions had begun implementing similar programs, recognizing the value of combining healthcare insights with judicial wisdom. Harrison's fellow judges, who'd initially worried about potential controversy, now sought his advice on incorporating holistic approaches to justice. "I have something to show you," Harrison said, leading Sarah to a newly completed wing of the center. A plaque beside the door read, "The Sarah Johnson Health Justice Initiative." Her hand flew to her pearls, the same strand she'd worn that first day in court, now accompanied by a matching bracelet Harrison had given her for Christmas. "Michael," She breathed, using the name she'd chosen for him all those years ago. "This isn't necessary." "Yes, it is," he replied firmly. "Your courage changed not just my life, but now it's changing thousands of others." Inside, the walls featured photographs of their journey. Sarah in her early nursing days, Harrison at his judicial inauguration, and newer images of them together at community events, family dinners, and working side by side at the center. The final photo showed them at last month's hospital fundraiser, their shared smile now familiar to everyone who knew them. As afternoon light filled the room, mother and son stood together, their shadows merging on the wall behind them. Through the window, they could see the old courthouse where their story began, its classical columns standing firm against the modern skyline. But their eyes were on the future, the waiting room already filling with people seeking the kind of justice that comes from understanding, acceptance, and the courage to embrace truth. "Ready for the afternoon session?" Harrison asked, offering his arm. Sarah smiled, linking her arm through his. "Together," she said, as they walked back toward their waiting audience, their steps in perfect harmony.